everybody. My name is Marjorie, and thank you so much, Andrea, for the wonderful introduction. And it's an honor to be here at Project Stand. Can you guys hear me okay? I know I'm wearing a mask. Okay. So I'm here representing the Asian American Student Union at the University of Maryland, which we had a little bit of a brief introduction for, but it is a political umbrella of the Asian American community on campus. And we are now celebrating our 30th year of being an established student organization on campus. As you can imagine, a lot has changed over the last 30 years. We just had in the last couple of months started to look through our archives and looking at our institutional knowledge and how our organization has changed since April the 4th, 1991. So looking at all the historiographical events throughout the last few years, and as well as the institutional issues from getting administrative support and other methods of student activism, especially in the early years of our organization. It's been really inspiring to see how much we have grown and how our organization has changed. Especially since ASU is now expanding different modes of access for our students, especially with the rise of anti-Asian hate in the last 2 years due to COVID-19. So I'm really excited to be able to share more of our work as well as my thoughts as a student researcher and somebody who is really involved in archiving, preserving, and researching advocacy efforts in the Washington, D.C. area, which is a very diverse place for both Asian Americans throughout history and as well as other Black and Latinx folks. But yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you, Zoe.
Hi, thank you again for letting me be here today. I'm really excited. I am Zoe. My bio's a little old. I'm 20 years old now. I am a sophomore at Morris Brown College, and I'm kind of new to the work in a way. I have a history of the work. My grandmother is Toni K. Bambara, an activist and professor from Spelman College, and so I kind of have a little bit of history with the work, but now it's me doing the work. I'm carrying on her mission. So I'm kind of new to the whole, I guess, organizing scene, but I don't really have, I guess, my people yet. I'm still trying to find people with like-minded missions. So I'm kind of just working all over the place and working with a lot of people, but I'm happy to be here and to continue to work with just young Black people in Atlanta that want to make a difference.
Thank you. And Jackie?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jackie. Thank you so much for having me participating in Project Stand, and Andrea for that wonderful introduction. To kind of expand upon Marjorie's points, I think something important about the Asian American Student Union on our campus is its long-standing history of student activism that often hasn't been emphasized or displayed by our campus administration. I think for a long time, our organization has been keeping records and preserving albums of photos and different events and newspapers and magazines that cite kind of the things that we've done and contributed. But really the only people who know that those archives and those materials exist are our current executive board. And so it takes kind of time and intentionality to kind of seek those out because they're kind of stuck in our locker right now. And so I think kind of an emphasis that we want to focus on as ASU is how do we properly display, archive, and properly keep these materials safe because they're incredibly important. I think also something to emphasize is that ASU's kind of preservation of our activism has been largely student-led. Our prior president, Heather Kim, actually made an entire website documenting ASU's activism towards establishing our Asian American Studies department. So I think it's really amazing to cite the fact that, all of this has started with our own students. And so our archiving efforts have been student-led. And so I hope to kind of continue that charge and also discuss our current advocacy efforts. And so hopefully, continuing to make ASU's history continuous and going beyond just remembering what we've done in the past, but also continuing to make history in the present. But yeah, totally excited for this conversation.
Thank you all. This is strong already. I mean, you all are engaged in the organizing and very much aware of the historical importance of what you all are doing, which the attendees to this session, largely memory workers, archivists, historians, we are just, this is what we're pleased to hear, you know, that the students are so well aware of the importance of what you all are doing. So I'm going to jump in. I have several questions. You know, there's 3 of you, so I want you to please, you know, certainly answer and take your time, but you know, I will try not to rush through too much, but just make sure we stay kind of on time. The summer of 2020 brought on a lot of change. We saw what news outlets called the most extensive series of protests in history in the aftermath of the killings of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd. These protests saw 15 million to 26 million participants, according to the Harvard Kennedy Carr Center. Curious if you all will just kind of share your thoughts as you witnessed some of these protests. They happened around the country and across multiple continents. Can you all speak to whether or not you were engaged in some of those protests and, you know, what it felt like to see, and in some cases, like I said, participate in the protests that were largely multicultural? And I can start with Zoe. We'll start with Zoe.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was out every day last year, basically. From May to January of this year, I was out a lot. And I guess growing up, I've seen a lot of people behind the scenes doing the work, but seeing so many people of so many different backgrounds was very nice to see, because we all have common enemies. And I think that's the main thing. We're all fighting white supremacy. We're all fighting systematic issues. And so for all of us to come together in that way, it made me really happy and know that my work is important and everybody's work is important and we all want the same thing. But yeah, last year was crazy. I did, like in my bio, I did get arrested last year, almost got arrested a couple more times here in Atlanta, tear gas, the whole 9. But the one thing that I saw that was a common theme throughout that was community. There were so many medics, just people out there giving people water, snacks, checking in on people, hugging people, trying with the mask on. A lot of people wearing masks, which was pretty awesome as well. But I guess the main thing, I think we all grew closer together. That was the main thing that I saw.
Jackie, I can go to you next if you care to speak on this.
Yeah, I think at that time I was serving as the co-president of AESU, and so along with my other co-president, our first kind of thought was to reach out to our Black student campus leaders and to check on them, kind of to emphasize like Zoe's discussion of community, because obviously like we were going through a transformative time and we wanted to make sure that our own campus was okay, because obviously we didn't necessarily have like the lived experiences to really like try and lead the charge. So trying to like amplify those voices. So we reached out to them, kind of checked in with those people, because obviously like I think that's a huge part of activism and sustainable activism is making sure that like those around you are okay. And then we kind of led our own conversation within our community to discuss like anti-Blackness and things like that. So I think a lot of our work was kind of internally focused on our campus community, because that's where we saw we could enact change and also make sure that our Black student leaders felt like they were supported during that time.
Wonderful solidarity. Marjorie?
Yeah, I also just want to highlight Jackie's point of like, as an organization, we were enacting those efforts and checking in, but also trying to raise monetary resources for those involved in mutual aid for more national nonprofit organizations. So I know last summer I'm immunocompromised, so I wasn't able to really go outside as much as I would want to. But through like looking at different ways to get involved in the effort and the movement, I did donation commission. So I donated some of my talents in art and drew a bunch of stuff and encouraged folks to donate to different organizations, to mutual aid efforts, and was able to raise like a couple $100 through that, in addition to the AUC fundraiser. So monetary support, I also have to underscore, especially for those on the ground, help fund some of the resources they were doing. And I specifically donated to BALT, which is a nonprofit in Baltimore. So through those like more insular efforts as well.
Thank you. And that's so important for us to consider. There are so many different roles here. And even as we think about documentation, in the archives, so much of, some of our historical movements, it's the art, it's the flyers, that accompany photographs and strategy documentation. But we see a lot of kind of, like I said, posters, art, that people are very interested in to see, how people were impacted and express themselves in these creative fashions, and they're all working together. So thank you for that. I want to go to also in the summer of 2020, we witnessed the centering of violence taking place towards Asian American Pacific Islander community with the rise of the coronavirus pandemic. We saw calls for legislation and discussion around the long history of violence that has occurred historically in the US against the AAPI community as well. I'd like to hear from you all about how this uptick in violence impacted you all as members of this community and people in solidarity and as student activists. And I'm getting a little bit emotional thinking about all of even these two questions are, so please take your time as you help us to consider your thoughts during, as you reflect on that time and today. Sorry, I'll start with Jackie.
Yeah, I think last year was pretty tough to serve on ASU. I think for us, with the onset of the pandemic, we came out with a statement basically saying like, we acknowledge that there's a lot of like anti-Asian racism right now, please take care of yourself, that kind of stuff. But once the shooting in Atlanta happened, that's kind of when it hit. My co-president and I, we were on spring break, and so we thought we were going to get some time to like recharge before we continue with our activism. And then everything kind of like stuff hit the fan, and we really had to respond. And I think at that point we realized like statements and like words like are important, but at a certain point, like we reached a breaking point where we really need to take action. And so that's kind of where the inspiration for our social justice task force was started. So this past semester, my co-president and I started this task force, and with the help of both our executive board members and the rest of our community, we came up with a list of demands or critical issues to address some of our feelings of like anti-Asian sentiment on campus, and also just visibility, because I think a big issue on our campus right now is just allowing our students to feel like they have a space and they are visible and that they matter. And I think one of the more pivotal moments was that we had a vigil on campus to honor those who were killed in the Atlanta shooting. I had the honor to speak at the vigil, and it was such a powerful moment to realize, because it was the middle of the pandemic still, like it was really hard to get people together because of safety reasons, but people still showed up because it was like in an outdoor place. And so just seeing people there supporting one another, and like standing in solidarity, remembering the lives lost, was super powerful. And it made me realize like the importance of having this kind of campus community and also having that kind of support, because it felt so crushing to have to bear the burden alongside my co-president to kind of respond to this. So having people there supporting us was super powerful, and it still makes me emotional to think about to this day.
I totally understand that. Marjorie?
Yeah, sure. So as we all know, like there is strength in numbers, and like seeing people at the vigil was really one way that it felt like these issues matter, at least on the campus level. It was live stream, which was really great because I was stuck at home in Baltimore, and College Park is like 50 miles away. And I think that the power of community, especially when you're isolated, was really, really great to see. And I think there was a question like about the interruptions in campus learning, like even though all of these things happened during spring break and like in the middle of the semester while we had like our midterms and stuff, our professors still expected us to keep going. We were all so pressured to do work in a capitalist sense, to contribute to on-campus discussions. And at times it felt a lot of tokenizing, like being invited to panels to speak on anti-Asian discrimination and like anti-Asian hate and so forth. Like not only did it feel performative, it felt tokenizing. And I think that had a lot of impact on not as just as us as a e-board, but also as Asian American bodies on campus. And I think for a lot of people on campus, it was the first time they really felt discrimination. So there's a lot of complexity with race relations now. I think that people are starting to wake up for the general body, which for some not so, not at an early exposure, but the conversation is starting to move forward. And how do we stop this? And how do we work together with our other marginalized student groups to better advocate for ourselves while still working at school and on our other events and stuff. Really, really exhausting, but hopefully it'll be better this upcoming year.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing that point up about the performative and tokenism, actions and your feelings on that, because that is so key. Zoe, did you want to comment?
During that time, I was completely heartbroken. And I know with, in solidarity, the most important thing if you want to be an ally is not speak for people, but to expand their message. So I know a couple people who are in the work who are Asian, and I was like, what do you want me to do? Anything you want me to do, I'll help. I donated, I reposted things, I did whatever that I could to show up, because I never, of course, want to be anybody's voice. And so that was my main thing, is how can I help uplift yours? With the platform that I have, how can I do to help? So that was my main thing, was what can I do to help? I don't want to take over or do anything like that. So.
Thank you all. It's staying in the same vein, but can you all speak to, yesterday we spoke with archivists at HBCUs, and one of the questions was about student activism across campuses. And I'm particularly interested in cross-cultural engagement. Can any of you speak to relationships you might have with other campuses? Do you all engage with other local area campuses in your area to kind of advance the activism work you're doing? I'll start with Marjorie.
Yeah, the first example that I can think of is the conference that I organized last November, Field of Revolution, where we had a couple of different university groups. From American University, we invited their Asian American Student Union to do a queer Asian American storytelling workshop, and having that space to express ourselves was one way that they contributed to our work, to our conference, as well as Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. They did a workshop on data disaggregation, which is not entirely an Asian American issue. It's all ethnic groups. So seeing the different threads of like cross-cultural, like inter-ethnic issues as well, and the different ways that it affects our communities and in advocacy efforts in conjunction, was one where we saw a little bit of the cross-cultural connections within the similar geographic space, and continuing those conversations today.
Thank you. Zoe, can you weigh in?
So with the archives and things like that, I basically grew up at Spelman, so I was able to go with Miss Holly, who is wonderful. She would open up the archives for me and my mother to look at my grandmother's papers, because they are at Spelman's archives. And that was a great way for me to connect to my grandmother. I never met her. She died 6 years before I was born. So that definitely fueled my activism, was to see her work in front of me and able to connect with her in that way. So that's how it kind of, I guess, fueled my activism and my organizing and how I view community, was being able to see her, pretty much her brain on papers, and able to just to see everything. Because like I said, I didn't get to meet her, but that was how I was able to connect.
Wonderful. Jackie?
Yeah, to kind of expand on Marjorie's kind of discussion of like our connections with like other campus Asian American student unions, we host, or like all of the Asian American student unions on the East Coast hold an annual conference that exists at different universities depending on who gets to sponsor. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity for us oftentimes to like go meet other people and to kind of engage in that cross campus work, because that's where we were able to meet partners from American University, Georgetown, GW, like those kinds of areas, and to kind of connect with them and build those relationships. And so now we have like a pretty strong DMV network, which I think is pretty great. To discuss kind of like cross-cultural connections, I think this last year with our activism efforts, we collaborated with the NAACP to discuss like relationships between the APIDA and the Black community. We also partnered with Plumas, which is like a Latinx student activist organization, with issues related to documentation and immigration. So like Marjorie said, like there are a lot of like interethnic issues that cross over and that provides space for us to collaborate. And so I think that's allowed us to make this great working relationship, because at the end of the day, like activism is very important, but the relationships you hold with the people doing the activism, I think is even more important, because they end up becoming your friends. They become like the people you confide in. And so I'm really happy to have those kinds of people by my side and to kind of discuss these kinds of things with as well.
Thank you. So you all have all touched on, historical importance and archives. And Zoe, you mentioned being able to reflect on your grandmother's work in the archives. And I think, was it Marjorie mentioning about the, was it Jackie mentioning about the, one of your students that helped with the Asian studies, helping to develop that Asian American Studies department and have that website to talk about the history. So my next question for you all is kind of about issues of your own privacy. So thinking about the archives, because you all have benefited from seeing archives that maybe do detail people's names, but talk about your own thoughts about privacy. You all are student activists who are, organizing conferences, demonstrations, teach-ins, etc. You're bringing awareness to racialized violence. How much do you think about your own privacy and surveillance, especially against the backdrop of our current political climate? And, we have states that are trying to ban, teaching racism, demonizing critical race theory. How, as archivists and memory workers, the people listening to you today are considering, like, how do we do this work and ethically care for our student activists? So talk to us a little bit about how you feel or anything you've witnessed in terms of privacy for yourselves. I'm going to start with Marjorie.
Yeah, this is, I think, a really great question. I've been thinking a lot about privacy as a student activist, because in the Filipino American community, there is such a large stigma with activism because of the transnational threads of the Marcos dictatorship, and as well as the current Duterte administration, where activists are getting shot down, like murdered, like taken away, kidnapped, and so forth. And I think that in the recent years in American, at least rhetoric, that activism has a more acceptable connotation, but very much in my homeland and like my circles, it's still very dangerous to label yourself as such. Like my parents, they do not know much about, they're not privy to a lot of my student organizing work, but they said, be careful in terms of being documented and photographed and archived as such, because if that ever comes back, there is danger and violence associated with that word. But I guess in my own personal feelings about my own privacy, I think that archiving is really, really important in understanding the work that we're currently doing. And I do not mind having my name attached to something if people are able to seek me out for information later on in the research, because I'm currently studying transnational activism in the 1960s to 80s, but in the Filipino American community, and everything's redacted. There are not a lot of pictures. And there's issues in trying to uncover my own histories, the histories of the DMV in relation to the Asian American movement, but it's really difficult because of the fear of violence and retribution on the transnational scene. And I think that is a context that needs to be acknowledged, especially with archiving work, that activism is inherently dangerous in some spaces, especially in the Southeast Asian communities. So I guess it differs for each person, but that's how I feel and understand privacy and censorship.
Thank you, Jackie.
Yeah, I think to expand upon Marjorie's point, I think there's kind of a sentiment within at least like the Asian American and particularly like the Asian immigrant community to kind of put your head down and to remain kind of like incognito and to remain relatively private, because there is kind of like a fear of being singled out or like of being too loud. Like you should kind of put your head down and just work hard. And so I think there are safety issues, but I think there are also kind of like cultural issues as well that kind of prevent people from really wanting to have their name out there and to be documented. I think conversely, kind of with the work that my co-president and I did last year, we had some frustrations about us being recognized, like us as an organization being recognized for the work that we did. For example, we once had like, after the Atlanta shooting, like there was an article in our school newspaper discussing like anti-Asian violence, and my co-president and I gave like an hour-long interview and they never referenced us. And so I think there was big frustration in the idea that like we are giving all of this labor to you and discussing all of these issues and kind of representing our community, but you don't represent us or kind of document us in the school newspaper, which is important. Those are actual like university archives and records. And so I think it can go both ways, right? There is like a fear of being documented and having your name out there, but then there's also kind of the converse of like, do you get silenced? Do you even get represented? Does your name go down in history and that kind of stuff? So I think balancing that is really important, because like it can tip either way, and there are safety issues and then there are issues with recognition. So kind of just to bring like another perspective to this kind of discussion as well.
I just want to quickly follow up, Jackie. Was anything done to remedy this, or?
We discussed it with the reporter because my co-president and I were like frustrated, but there was another executive board member whose like quotations were put in the article, and he was mad on behalf of us. So after that kind of discussion, basically like the issue was that she like interviewed a lot of people and it was hard to put everything into the article. I think to this day, I'm still kind of mad because I think I contributed like some pretty interesting points that she could have put in her article, but at the end of the day, I also understand that it's like a publication and it's a newspaper and they need to do edits. I think also my frustration is they were for stories of like individual students who faced anti-Asian violence. And personally, like I have the privilege of not experiencing like a direct attack, but they were looking for those kind of like visceral accounts. And I was like, why could you not also include kind of like the social justice, like activist standpoint as well? Because I think that is additionally important, not just kind of like the trauma porn of just like, I faced violence in a grocery store, like that kind of stuff. So that frustrated me a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry for that. Maybe there'll be an opportunity for you to even write and you know, like an op-ed or something like that, you know. Zoe, do you want to speak about kind of privacy, thoughts on privacy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I kind of grew up, my mom is a very private person, so I've kind of already grown up with that type of mindset. But this really reminds me of a conversation me and my mother had following the Toni Morrison documentary, and how a lot of people were kind of upset that they didn't get to see more, or didn't like the stuff that she spoke about in the documentary, people already knew. And my mother was like, she does a lot, you know, she's contributed a lot to this community, and we don't need to know everything. And so that ever since that conversation, that has stuck with me, is that I will give what I allow. I'm not going to tell you everything. I'm not going to show everything. I'm entitled to my privacy. But like, of course, like with Marjorie pointed on, like the community work, and people can come back and ask me questions, and that's really important. But there are some things that I just may not talk about, or I may not show, because I am entitled to that privacy to a certain extent. I'm still human. So I think that's the main thing. We don't have to be just open books all the time. We should still be able to live our lives privately to a certain extent, even though we are doing the work.
I'm gonna just kind of quickly go around and find out. I think Marjorie and Jackie in particular, you all are working with student organizations that are a part of the university, as well as I'm sure external. Zoe, my impression, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that your work is a little bit more in the community as opposed to being a direct campus organization. Quickly, could you all give me your thoughts on if you were, part of a sanctioned, and some of you are, organization of the institution, how would you feel about your tweets? And I don't know if you tweet from, say, your, on behalf of the organization. How would you feel about the organization? Maybe I can say it like that. Being documented from your Twitter account, and names being associated. Could you just quickly touch on that as we, consider privacy a little bit more? Zoe, your thoughts on that?
So I just want to make sure I'm clear. Like, so with our tweets, can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think, it kind of threw a lot in there, but, just thinking about if you're, so for instance, my library, AUC Woodruff Library, we document the history of the AUC schools. If we were to begin collecting Twitter accounts, how would you feel about your name being identified in Twitter even, and knowing that these are kind of quick statements and, not that they're not well thought out, but, sometimes quickly responding to news or other protests, movements, or, things that have occurred, part of many of the archivists want to document that. Just curious how you would feel about that in particular, because there's a difference between, some of our documents and images that we might present for an archival collection, as opposed to, like I said, like a Twitter, which you are not thinking about this as being archival per se, you're kind of in the moment. So I'm just trying to get your perspective on being a 20-year-old, 21-year-old, 19-year-old, thinking about that, would you be okay? And let me say, I'm 41 years old. and it's, it's a question for me too, about, how you might be viewed, in history, this kind of context. So answer that any way you would like. Zoe, we'll start.
I think with me, I would be okay with it as long as it's not attached to an organization's name. Because I think that's my main thing. Like all my social media bios basically say these thoughts are my own, and I don't reflect any other organization or anything like that. So that would be my main concern, because sometimes with organizations that I work with, I may not agree on everything, and they may not agree with me on everything. So that's my main thing. I don't really regret things that I post, because I always talk to my mom before I post it to see, is this offensive, Mom, or does this work? So that's my main thing, but I think I would be okay with that as long as I'm not reflecting anybody else or any organization.
Thank you. Jackie?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on representing AASU, because I'm going to be honest, we're not very active on Twitter. I honestly forgot that we had a Twitter account because the primary modes that we use are Facebook and Instagram. And so I think Instagram is probably our most active account, where we post a lot of things, but I think we have a really great social media team. Like our vice president of communications does a wonderful job making graphics, and last year our VP did an amazing job. And so I think in that case, I would love to have my name tied to that kind of stuff because I think it's well thought out. Like the graphics are beautiful. In regards to my own like private Twitter account, I mean, my name's attached to it, so I wouldn't mind necessarily, because those are my thoughts at the time, and I would want those kind of documented, because like I think it shows the progression of how my thoughts and my activism has changed over time, and I think that's important to document because people do change and their thoughts change. But in terms of AASU's own documentation, I definitely want that to be preserved. Marjorie and I were kind of talking about this, but last year our vice president of communications did like a Spotify Wrapped, but like for all of the things we did in that year as AASU. And it's a powerful reflective tool because it allows you to see like, wow, in this academic year, look at what we've done. And so I think that's also like the power of archiving and making sure we have like social media posts preserved as well.
Thank you. And Marjorie?
Yeah, I definitely echo what Jackie said. I'm meeting with our comms team today about like what we can do as a team. And I really had to reflect on how I use social media as a tool and method for activism, because I'm not really that active on either platform, on Twitter or Instagram, to get the word out on my personal thoughts, mostly like a retweeting type of thing, or connecting with other scholars and activists in my field. In Asian American studies. Like I put out like maybe 1 or 2 tweets. I'll be like, I want to look for an academic advisor for grad school. Twitter is great for that. But in terms of having my name attached to things, I think that in terms of my media usage, it might not be as appropriate because it's a lot of astrology, it's a lot of like just memes. But in terms of my organization, I think that there is a lot of great work being done, as well as the efforts on connecting with other organizations on that front. So you can see in our following list are like the connections that we have as ASU that is reflective on social media. But yeah, definitely personally, you can look at my astrology tweets, but I don't think it's going to be as relevant.
What is your sign, Marjorie?
I am a Scorpio sun, and I think it shows.
All right. Thank you all. So staying with the theme of archives a bit, have any of you, and just jump in if you have, worked with an archivist, and Zoe, please, I know that you mentioned about Spelman, so feel free to expand upon this or any other occasions. But just interested to hear from you all. Have you worked with archivists or memory workers, whether at your institution or in the community, to begin documenting the work that you have been doing in any kind of way or realm, or are engaged with any of your organizations in doing that kind of work? Anybody can jump in.
Okay, I'm a Pisces, so I just want to say that. So water signs, but ever since I started my own personal work, my dad told me to write down everything. So I have so many journals, and my mom says I'm like my grandmother in this way. I have like 6 journals in my bed right now with a whole bunch of pencils, but I literally write down every thought, every action, everything, because my dad says that's something I can definitely look back on later in life for whatever I need it for. So, and that's definitely because my mom told me to do the same thing, because my grandmother kept accounts of everything, literally everything. And so I was like, okay, maybe I need to do this as well. So I definitely keep account of my own personal things, whatever I do.
Yeah, I'm gonna hop in. I worked extensively with the Hornbeck Library at the University of Maryland because they do host the Filipino American Community Archives, which I have worked with my own research, but also with the curator, I don't know what the name is, the lead archivist, Rita N. Caucus, who part of that foundation, she contributed and gathered all of these materials. As I'm doing more oral histories within my own research of transnational activism, I'm wanting to donate it to that space because it has already served as a resource for me, and I want to be able to contribute that back for those who come after. And I think that I also write everything down, even if it's the most mundane task. But I've had to learn not to be a perfectionist in my own like learnings and work and reading, documenting what I'm reading, especially because it has been a source of my inspirations moving forward.
I said this in the chat, but I'm a Cancer, so it looks like we're representing the water signs right now in this panel. But I personally have not worked a lot with like UMD archivists, which I'm hoping is something that can change because as the co-vice president of advocacy, one of our talking points or one of our critical issues is to establish a cultural center for Asian American students on campus. And we're currently working with administration to kind of like find a space because this campus is kind of busy and full right now, where we can kind of establish that. And one of our hopes is to actually use that as a space to kind of remember student activist history, specifically for the Asian American community on campus. And so I think that's where we'll kind of be working in tandem with archivists to kind of like carve out that space. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Good luck with that. That's wonderful. And Lael is probably a great contact. Yes, you are looking forward to connecting. Just in the spirit of sharing, I'm a Gemini. I don't know where that fits in here, but but no, thank you all so much. This has been a wonderful conversation, and we still have some time. I want to go ahead and jump to the Q&A.